The Galactic Council had never asked humans for anything. That was the rule. The unspoken, deeply held, universally agreed upon rule that every species in the Conquered had followed since the moment humanity stumbled into faster-than-light travel 40 years ago. You did not ask humans for help. You watched them from a safe distance. You kept your borders politely firm and your tone carefully neutral. And if they ever looked at you with that particular kind of calm that meant they were calculating something, you smiled, nodded, and backed away slowly. But the Vorith had come. And the Vorith did not care about rules. They hit the Conquered's eastern reach in 3 waves. The first wave destroyed the listening posts. The second wave destroyed the fleets sent to stop them. The third wave was still coming, and the Council had exactly nothing left to send against it. The Kelvari Armada, the finest military force the Conquered had assembled in 200 years, was adrift somewhere between the Reach and the Sen Nebula. 47 warships, half of them dead, the other half barely breathing. And that was the day Ambassador Quell of the Talari people walked into the United Earth Council chambers and said the 4 words his species had spent 4 decades carefully avoiding. "We need your help." Admiral Mara Voss heard about it on a Tuesday. She was eating a sandwich, turkey, mustard, the good kind that came in the glass jar, not the plastic squeeze bottle. She had exactly 12 minutes before her next briefing, and she had decided those 12 minutes belonged to her and the sandwich and nothing else. Her aide, Lieutenant Brennan, had different ideas. He appeared in the doorway of her office the way he always did when he had bad news, shoulders up, chin slightly tucked, carrying a data pad like it was a grenade he didn't fully understand. "Admiral Brennan, we've received a transmission from the Galactic Council." She took another bite. "I gathered that from the way you're standing." He held out the data pad. She looked at it. She looked at her sandwich. She put the sandwich down on the desk with the careful precision of a woman filing a formal complaint with the universe, and she took the data pad. She read it twice. "They want us to salvage the Kelvari Armada," she said. "Yes, ma'am." 47 ships. 47 ships, 23 confirmed destroyed, 12 adrift with power. The remaining 12 are, he checked his notes, described as, quote, beyond conventional recovery. She put the data pad down next to the sandwich. "And they're asking us. You specifically. The Council's transmission names you by rank and name, which the Talari ambassador explained to us is, culturally speaking, a very significant gesture. Apparently they researched who to ask." She picked her sandwich back up. "They researched me. They researched humanity's approach to, I'm reading this directly, the repair of things that should not still function." Mara chewed, swallowed, stared at the wall. Outside her window, the orbital shipyard above New Auckland was already lit up in every bay. Shifts running around the clock. Ships that shouldn't be ships yet being made into ships anyway, because that was the job, and the job did not stop for reasonable objections. "Get me Commander Yale and Chief Engineer Patel," she said. "Get me 6 of our best salvage ships. Get me 2 destroyers for escort. And get me a copy of every Kelvari technical schematic the Council is willing to hand over. They've offered full access to their technical archives, ma'am." "Good," she finished the sandwich. "Tell the Council we'll leave in 72 hours. Brennan's eyebrows went up. They were expecting us to negotiate terms for at least 72 hours, Brennan. He left. She sat alone in her office for a moment. Outside, the sun was coming up over the Tasman Sea, painting the water that deep orange that always made her feel like the world was on fire, but in a way she didn't mind. She looked at the data pad again, at the coordinates, at the casualty figures. 23 confirmed destroyed. The math of that sat in her chest like a stone. She'd seen casualty figures before. She'd seen a lot of things she didn't talk about at dinner parties. She'd served in the Belt Wars, back when humans were still figuring out what it meant to fight in space, when they were making it up as they went because there was no one ahead of them to copy. She'd learned how to fix a ship with her own hands because there were days when there was no one else around to do it. She'd learned how to look at something broken and ask not can this be saved, but what will it take? That was apparently what the Conquered had heard about. The repair of things that should not still function. She almost smiled, packed her data pad, went to work. The fleet they assembled was not impressive to look at. The two destroyers, Relentless and Cape Horn, were solid but nothing special. The 6 salvage vessels were big, ugly, functional ships that looked like someone had bolted tools onto a brick and called it a day. The crew across the whole operation was maybe 1,100 people, a mix of Navy engineers, civilian salvage specialists, 3 xenotechnical consultants, and one man named Dario who had worked on every class of alien vessel that had ever passed through a human port, and who described his specialty simply as figuring it out. The council sent a liaison, a Kelvari officer named Subcommander Varys, who arrived on the Relentless looking like he had not slept in several days and was running entirely on duty, and something Mara suspected might be the Kelvari equivalent of grief. He was tall, pale blue, 3 eyes, the middle one slightly larger than the other 2. He stood in the docking bay and looked at the salvage fleet with the careful, controlled expression of a person who had prepared themselves to be disappointed and was trying very hard not to show that the disappointment had already arrived. Mara walked up to him and shook his hand the way she shook every hand, like she meant it. "Subcommander Varys, I'm Admiral Voss." "Admiral," his translator rendered his voice in flat, even tones. "I must tell you, our engineers have assessed what remains of the Armada. Their conclusion was that recovery is—" He paused. The word seemed to cost him something. They said impossible was perhaps too strong a word, but that implausible was accurate. "Implausible," she repeated. "Yes. I've been called that myself." She turned toward the ships. "Walk with me, Sub-Commander. Tell me everything your engineers know about the Kelvari Power Core." He walked with her, and as he talked, describing the damage, the structural failures, the cascade shutdowns, the things the Vorath had done to ships that were supposed to be the best the Conquered had ever built, she listened with the focused, unhurried attention of someone taking inventory. Not of what was lost, of what remained. They jumped into the Reach 4 days later. The first thing you noticed was the debris. It came up on sensors before it came up on visual. Thousands of objects spread across a volume of space the size of a small solar system. Hull fragments, reactor casings, things that had been ships that had stopped being ships that were now just geometry floating in the dark. The second thing you noticed was the silence. Space was always silent, technically speaking, but there was a difference between the silence of empty space and the silence of space where something had happened. The crew of the Relentless felt it and didn't say anything about it, the way you don't say anything when you're at a funeral and you already know everyone else feels the same thing you feel. Sub-Commander Varys stood on the bridge and looked at the view screen and said nothing at all. Mara stood beside him and let him have that. Then she said, "Scan for active power signatures. Start with the strongest and work down. I want a triage list in the next 2 hours." "Yes, Admiral." The work started. The first ship they found with a living crew was the Kelvari Sunspear. It had power in 3 sections. The hull was breached in 2 places. 61 crew remaining from an original complement of 212. They'd been drifting for 9 days, running life support off a backup system that was designed for 48 hours and had been coaxed, repaired, and manually sustained by the survivors for 9 times that long. Chief Engineer Patel took a team aboard. She was back on comms in 20 minutes. "Admiral, these people kept this ship alive with wire and stubbornness. I genuinely respect it. Can we help them?" "Oh, absolutely. Give me 6 hours and a full toolkit and I can have this thing moving under its own power." Mara looked at Varys. He was watching the data feed from the Sunspear, with an expression she was starting to recognize. The look of a person seeing something that didn't match their expectations and not quite knowing how to file it. 6 hours, she said to Patel. You have 4. Patel laughed. It was the kind of laugh that meant challenge accepted. 4 it is. They found 12 ships with living crews. 3 of the hulks were too far gone. The Vorath had hit them with something that destabilized the molecular bonding in the hull itself, and there was nothing to work with. And Mara documented them and marked them and moved on, because that was the only thing you could do. The remaining 12 became the project. Dario looked at each one like they were puzzles, which they were. Puzzles with dying people inside them, but puzzles. He walked the corridors of the Kelvari Bright Spear in a pressure suit and took notes on a battered paper notebook. He carried everywhere paper, actual paper, because he said screens were too easy to accidentally delete things on. And he came back to the Relentless and spread those notes out on the table in the engineering bay and talked for an hour straight without stopping. The Kelvari power system is a triaxial lattice. You probably knew that. What you maybe don't know is that when it fails, it doesn't fail the way ours does. It doesn't blow out. It folds. The energy pathways collapse inward, which means the core is still technically intact. It's just locked. You can't turn it on again from inside the system because the system reads itself as already on. He looked at the engineers around the table. So you have to convince it that it's off. Silence. How? Someone asked. You introduce a countersignal. You make the system think it's receiving a shutdown command from an external authority, which means you need a frequency that the Kelvari core recognizes as authorized. He flipped his notebook to a page covered in hand-drawn diagrams. Fortunately, I have spent 11 years working on alien vessels in port, and I have a very good guess about that frequency. It's going to sound wrong. It's going to sound like we're making the problem worse. And then it's going to work. He looked around the table again. Questions? You said guess, Lieutenant Brennan said from the back of the room. Educated guess. How educated? Dario thought about it. I'm about 83% on this. That leaves 17%. Yeah, he clicked his pen. That's the interesting part. Subcommander Varys found Mara on the observation deck that night, ship night. Anyway, the arbitrary darkness they imposed on the clock to keep human bodies believing in time. She was standing at the viewport looking out at the wreck of the Kelvari Dawn, which was the largest of the remaining ships and the one they were scheduled to attempt first thing in the morning. Admiral, he stopped a respectful distance away. Subcommander, I wanted to ask you something. He was quiet for a moment, working up to it. Your engineer, the one with the notebook, he says he is 83% certain his method will work. He does. In the Concord, an 83% confidence level on a procedure of this magnitude would not be approved for implementation. The threshold is 95%. Mara looked out at the Dawn. It was a beautiful ship, even wrecked. The Kelvari built beautiful things. Long, elegant lines designed to look like something alive. Even torn open, even dark, it had a kind of dignity to it. If we waited for 95% certainty, she said, those crews would be dead before we got there. Varys was quiet. We tried 95% once, she said. Belt wars. We waited for certainty before we sent rescue. By the time we were certain, there was no one left to rescue. She didn't look away from the viewport. We decided we'd rather be wrong quickly than right slowly. Took us a few bad years to figure that out, but we figured it out. The Dawn hung in the dark, patient and broken. Varys looked at it too. I will be in the engineering bay at 0600, he said. If it is acceptable, I would like to observe. It's more than acceptable, Mara said. Bring your engineers. Dario likes an audience. It makes him perform better. She almost smiled. So did he. Tomorrow, they would try to turn the power back on in a ship that believed it was already running. They would send a signal into the dark, and hope it spoke the right language. That was the job. The job did not wait for certainty. The job began at 0600. At 0600, Dario was already in the Calvari Dawn's engineering section. He had been there since 0200. Nobody asked him to do that. He had just shown up with his notebook and a thermos of coffee and started taking the walls apart. Mara learned this from Lieutenant Brennan when she arrived at the docking collar, still pulling on her jacket, to find Subcommander Varys and 4 Calvari engineers already suited up and ready. She looked at the airlock display that showed Dario's biosign beacon somewhere in the belly of the Dawn and stopped. "He went early," Brennan said. "How early?" 4 hours ago, ma'am." She processed this. Did he take anyone with him? Petty Officer Chandra, and one of the Xenotech consultants, Dr. Sue. Is he still talking? Brennan checked his comm. He's been on open mic the whole time. I have a transcript. He held up the data pad. It's mostly diagrams and what sound like rhetorical questions to the ship. Mara looked at Varys. Varys looked at the airlock. Your people, Varys said carefully, are unusual. Frequently, she agreed. Let's go in. The dawn was cold. Cold the way only a dead ship was cold. Not the surface cold of space, but the deep, settled cold of a place that had been without heat long enough that the cold had become structural. It lived in the walls, in the floor, in the air that the salvage team pumped in through portable units. The emergency lighting that Dario had rigged on his first visit gave everything a dim amber color, like the inside of a lantern. The Calvari engineers from Varys's team moved through the corridors carefully, noting damage, exchanging words in their own language too quietly for the translator to catch. Mara watched their faces. She had gotten reasonably good at reading Calvari expressions in the past few days. The middle eye was the most expressive. The side eyes were more for peripheral threat assessment, and the tilt of the crest of cartilage above the brow was the equivalent of what a human did with their eyebrows. Right now, their crests were very low. They were grieving the ship. She understood that. She had stood in the hull of the UNSS Meridian once, after the Battle of Ceres, and she had understood for the first time that a ship was not just a machine. It was a place where people had lived and worked and eaten bad cafeteria food and argued about shift schedules and called home on the comms when they thought nobody was listening. A dead ship was a cemetery with engines. She let the Calvari engineers grieve. Then she followed the sound of Dario's voice. He was in the primary engineering corps, which was the size of a large gymnasium, and currently looked like someone had put a gymnasium through a blender set to medium. Conduits had been torn loose. Control panels were cracked. One entire section of floor grating had been blown upward by some kind of pressure event, and then settled back down at a 20-degree angle. In the middle of all of it, Dario sat on a crate, notebook open, talking to Petty Officer Chandra and Dr. Sue, and the triaxial core housing in more or less equal measure. The core housing was a massive hexagonal structure running floor to ceiling. It was not lit. It was not humming. It was just sitting there being very firmly convinced that it was fully operational in a way that had resulted in it being completely non-functional. So the folding is consistent with what I projected, which is good, because if it wasn't, I'd have had to start over, and I really didn't want to start over, Dario was saying. The question is whether the counter frequency I calculated will hit the right resonance. The core doesn't have ears, obviously. It has sensor arrays. We're going to be talking to the sensor arrays and convincing them they're receiving a legitimate council-level shutdown authorization, which they haven't received, and which technically doesn't exist for a ship in this state. But we're going to make up a very convincing fake one. You are going to falsify an authorization signal, said one of the Calvari engineers. His translator made his voice sound flat, but the middle eye had gone very wide. Dario looked up. Oh hey, yes, technically, but it's fine. That signal format is classified. It requires council-level encryption keys, which you should not possess. Dario clicked his pen twice. When your ships dock at human ports for resupply, they run a standard handshake protocol with our port authority systems. Port authority systems log everything. And I have worked at 3 different ports over 11 years, and I have very good relationships with the data archivists. He tilted his head. I'm not saying I did anything technically sanctioned. I'm saying I did something that worked, and that I will never be specific about in any official documentation. The Kelvari engineer stared at him. The middle eye had not gotten smaller. Mara stepped in before this became a diplomatic incident. Can the signal be delivered safely? Yes, I need to run a transmitter wire directly into the secondary sensor node. It's the one that's still warm, which means it's still active, which means it can receive. The node is behind that panel. He pointed to a wall panel. It's going to take about 40 minutes to get to it and another 20 to get the wire seated properly. And then we send the signal and we see what happens. He picked up his coffee. If I'm right, the core reboots. If I'm wrong, 17%, Brennan said quietly. If I'm wrong, probably nothing happens. Maybe a small cascade discharge. Very small, probably. Probably, Mara said. 83% probably. She looked at the core housing, then at the team, then at Varys, who was looking at Dario with the expression of someone watching a person juggle knives and trying to decide whether to be impressed or alarmed. Get the panel open, she said. It took 47 minutes, not 40, because the panel had been partially fused by heat, and they had to cut it open, and cutting required a plasma torch. And the plasma torch attracted the anxious attention of every Kelvari engineer in the room who kept asking, with impressive polite persistence, whether that was entirely necessary. And Chandra kept saying yes, and the engineer kept asking, and Mara eventually positioned herself between them so the cutting could get done. The secondary sensor node was a cylinder about the size of a large man's torso, nestled in a bed of conduit and shielding. It was warm. Warm meant alive, barely. Dario ran his hands over it with the focused gentleness of someone doing something that mattered. Beautiful, he said. Is it? Dr. Sue asked. The engineering. Look at this housing. This is load-bearing in 7 different directions simultaneously. The tolerances on this, he shook his head. Whoever designed this ship knew what they were doing. He looked up at Varys. The Kelvari built exceptional ships, Sub-Commander. I want you to know that. What the Vorith did to them is not a failure of design. What they did would have killed any ship in the galaxy. Varys was very still. The middle eye dropped slightly, not closing, just lowering, like a flag at half-mast. Thank you, he said. Dario nodded and went back to work. The transmitter wire went in 31 minutes. It was thin as surgical thread, more delicate than it looked, and Dario seated it with his bare fingertips in the last section because the tools were too thick for the gap. Chandra held the light. Dr. Sue held the notebook so Dario could refer to it without looking away from the node. Ready, Dario said. The room got quiet. When I send the signal, stand back from the core housing about 6 meters. Not because I think something bad will happen, just in case something good happens very enthusiastically. Everyone moved back 6 meters. Dario held the transmitter unit, a modified comm relay about the size of a book, covered in hand-soldered modifications that made the Kelvari engineers visibly uncomfortable, and he checked the frequency setting one more time. Then he looked at Mara. She looked back at him. Do it, she said. He sent the signal. The core housing sat there. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Someone exhaled. The sound was very loud. Then the core housing made a sound. Not a loud sound, not an explosion. A deep, resonant, almost musical hum that started somewhere below audible range and moved upward until it was in their chests. The amber emergency lighting flickered. Several conduits that had been dark for 9 days lit up in a pale blue-white sequence, running from the core outward along the walls like veins filling with blood. A panel above Dario's head clicked on. A display, in Kelvari script, scrolled through what Varys later confirmed was a boot sequence. Then, from deep in the ship, from the engine section, a sound like something very large deciding to breathe again. The floor vibrated, gently, then steadily. The Kelvari dawn was turning on. Dario sat down on the floor, which was not a planned action. He sat down because his legs had gone slightly optional, and he sat there with his notebook in his lap and watched the boot sequence scroll on the panel above him, and his face did something complicated. 83%, he said. To be fair, Chandra said, you nailed it. I know, he rubbed his face. I know, I'm always a little surprised when it works. One of the Kelvari engineers, the one who had been most insistent about the transmitter signal being technically unauthorized, sat down on the floor next to Dario. They sat there together, the tall pale blue alien and the rumpled human with the notebook, and they watched the Dawn come back to life. The Dawn's crew were in the aft section. 48 people, crowded into 4 compartments, surviving on emergency rations and recycled air. They had not had working lights for 6 days. When Mara's team reached them, they opened the bulkhead door into the pitch black and hit them with flashlights, and the crew of the Dawn, soldiers, all of them, trained warriors of the Kelvari Armada, made sounds that Mara had only ever heard from people who had stopped expecting rescue. It was not a comfortable sound to be responsible for. It was also one she would take over the alternative. Sub-Commander Varys pushed forward through her team. He spoke to the Dawn's crew in Kelvari, quickly and quietly, and Mara didn't have the translation because it was too fast and too low, but she understood the shape of it. It was the shape of I am here. We found you. You are not alone anymore, which translated the same way in any language. She stood back and gave them that. Let the moment be theirs. Then she called Patel. Chief, the Dawn's core is running. What's her structural status? Better than I expected. Patel's voice crackled with the good kind of energy. Main hull integrity is about 62%. She's not going to win any races, but she can move under her own power if we seal the 2 breach points in Section 7. My team can have that done in 8 hours. Give me 6. A pause, the sound of Patel grinning through the comm. 5.5, Patel countered. Deal. It took 5 hours and 40 minutes. While Patel's team worked, the Dawn's survivors were brought aboard the Relentless for medical attention, Kelvari Medical, which the human doctors handled with considerable improvisation, and the Xenotech consultants handled with a kind of focused intensity that suggested they had been waiting their whole careers for this exact challenge. 2 of the 48 didn't make it. They had been in worse shape than the initial scan showed, and the human doctors did everything they could, and it wasn't enough. And that was a fact that sat in the medical bay like a stone that couldn't be moved. Mara wrote their names in her log. She wrote everyone's names. It was the only discipline she had never broken in every operation she had ever run. You wrote their names. Outside, the work on the other 10 ships was already beginning. Dario was back in his salvage vessel with his notebook and 4 of the Kelvari engineers who had attached themselves to him, with the focused devotion of people who had just watched someone do the impossible and wanted to understand how. He was explaining the counter-frequency principle. They were taking notes. Mara watched this from the viewport for a moment. Then she pulled up the mission status report and started filling it in. Day 5 of salvage operation. 1 ship recovered, KAV Dawn. Core restart successful via modified counter-frequency transmitter. Crew survival, 48 of original 212. 2 fatalities post-rescue. She paused, then she added. Assessment of the Kelvari Armada's ships, extraordinary engineering. Assessment of the damage inflicted by the Vorith, extraordinary destruction. This operation will be difficult. We will complete it. She sent the report to the council. The council would read it in a day or so, filtered through 11 layers of bureaucracy and diplomatic protocol. But the Kelvari Dawn was already moving, slow, limping, 1/3 power but moving. And in the dark of the Reach, 8 more ships were waiting to find out if 83% was enough. Mara Voss was going to make sure it was. On day 9 of the salvage operation, they had recovered 6 ships. 6 out of 12. The work had gotten faster as it went because Dario's counter-frequency method, once it was confirmed, refined, and documented in an increasingly dog-eared notebook, had been shared with the Kelvari engineers in his growing orbit, and they had adapted it, improved it, built a version that could be delivered without the transmitter wire, which saved hours per ship. Dario had watched them adapt his idea and had said with genuine pleasure, "See, that's better. Write that down. Use that." He did not have any territory about the idea. It was a solution. Solutions were for using. Mara had noted this and made a mental mark that if she was ever writing any kind of report for the council about human-alien cooperation, this was going in it. The 6 recovered ships were in various states. The Dawn was the best off. The Kelvari Bright Spear had been the hardest, a 4-day effort that had required 3 separate counter-frequency attempts because the folding of the core had been more severe than anything Dario had encountered before. And by the end of it, he had been surviving on coffee and stubbornness in roughly equal proportions. The Bright Spear's engineering officer, a Kelvari woman named Sublieutenant Taryn, had worked beside him for all 4 days. She had barely slept either. When the Bright Spear's core finally came online on the 3rd attempt, at around 3 in the morning, ship time, she and Dario had stood in the engineering core, and neither of them had said anything for quite a long while. Then she had asked him, through the translator, how he had known the 3rd adjustment to the frequency would work. He had thought about it. "I didn't know. I thought it should work based on the resonance pattern of the 2nd attempt, but I didn't know. I just knew that the wrong option was to give up." She had looked at him, 3 eyes, the middle one very still. "That is not engineering, that is something else." "Yeah," he had said. "We call it being human. It's a very mixed bag." On the morning of day 9, the sensors found the Vorith. Not the 3rd wave, that was still en route, still 2 weeks out according to the last council report. These were a different group, a raider group from the profile, small but fast. 4 ships, running in what the Kelvari military database called a harvest formation, the kind of formation you used when you were coming back to a battle site to collect salvageable materials. They had come back to finish the job. Or rather, to take the pieces of the job that were still worth taking. Mara was on the bridge of the Relentless when the alarm came up. She looked at the trajectory. She looked at the 6 recovered ships, 2 of which were still in no condition to fight, 2 of which could defend themselves at low effectiveness, 2 of which, the Dawn and the Kelvari Spear, were at maybe 40% combat capacity. She looked at her own 2 destroyers, the Relentless and the Cape Horn. She did the math. The math was not comfortable. "ETA on the Vorith?" she asked. 40 minutes, Admiral, at their current speed." She turned to Varys, who had been on the bridge when the alarm came in, and was now standing with the precise stillness of a man doing a lot of fast thinking. "What do you know about Vorith raider formations?" she asked him. "They are aggressive but not disciplined. They rely on speed and the assumption that they are attacking a weaker force." He paused. "In this case, that assumption is correct. Let me ask you something." She pulled up the tactical display on the main screen. "If they see what looks like a functional fleet, full power signatures, active weapon systems, organized formation, what do they do?" Varys looked at the display, at the 6 recovered ships scattered at various positions through the debris field. Raiders do not engage a fleet at even odds. They look for easy targets. If they assess the target as defended, they leave. They would likely leave and report to the main force, which creates its own problems. But they leave. Yes, they would leave. Mara nodded. Then she opened a channel to every ship in the operation. This is Admiral Voss. We have 4 Vorith raiders incoming 40 minutes out. This is the situation. I need every ship with a functioning power core to look like it is fully combat operational in the next 35 minutes. I don't care if you are fully combat operational. I care if you look it. Weapons systems online even if you can't fire them. Formation position even if you can barely move. Full power signatures running hot. We are going to look like a fleet that has been expecting company. She paused. Chief Patel, tell me something good. Patel's voice came back from the Kelvari Silver Path, where she was in the middle of hull repairs. I can have the Silver Path's power core at 60% in 20 minutes. She looks like a warship. We just have to make her act like one. Do it. Dario, you're on the Bright Spear. What's her weapon status? A pause, then Dario's voice, careful and honest. The forward battery is non-functional. The rear battery is functional but limited range. The sensors and targeting systems are online. She can see them and she can threaten them, but she can't actually hurt them very badly. Can she look like she can hurt them? Another pause. She could hear him flipping through his notebook. Yes. If I reroute the sensor output through the targeting array and broadcast at maximum sensitivity, it will read on their sensors as active targeting lock. They won't be able to tell it's passive. Do it. Admiral, Vera stepped forward. This strategy assumes the raiders will not call our bluff. It does. If they do, then we fight with what we have. She kept her eyes on the display. We're not going to run. We've got crews on those ships, people in the middle of repairs, people who are barely alive. We don't run. Varys was quiet for 3 seconds. No, he said, we do not run. 32 minutes later, the human Kelvari salvage fleet was in formation. It had taken heroic efforts from every team across every ship. Patel had gotten the Silver Path to 63% power and positioned her in the formation's anchor position. Dario had set the Bright Spear's targeting broadcast to paint every approaching ship in a full active lock. The 2 human destroyers moved to the forward flanks, which were the most aggressive positions. The Dawn and the recovered Kelvari Steadfast took the midline. The 2 ships that were still not fully recovered, the Kelvari Sunreach and the Golden Name, were tucked behind the formation. They had power. They looked it. From a tactical sensor perspective, what the approaching Vorith raiders were going to see was a fleet of 8 warships in a standard combat engagement formation. All hot, all locked, all waiting. The relentless bridge was very quiet. 38 minutes after the initial alarm, the Vorith ships came into sensor range. They came in fast the way raiders always came in, expecting to find wreckage and easy salvage. They expected the dark, the floating debris, the dead. What they found was 8 ships sitting in formation, weapons hot, watching them arrive. The Vorith ship slowed. Mara watched the tactical display, watched the formation geometry change as the raiders lost their certainty and started flying defensive patterns instead of approach patterns. They're running active scans, the sensor officer said. Let them scan, Mara said. The Bright Spear's targeting broadcast was on every ship in the formation. On the Vorith sensors, it would read as multiple targeting locks. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. 1 minute, 2. Lead ship is changing course, the sensor officer said. The surprise in her voice was professionally controlled but not entirely gone. There, all changing course. The 4 Vorith raiders turned away from the formation. They accelerated. They ran. The relentless bridge held its silence for 1 more moment. Then someone in the back laughed. It was a short, involuntary sound. The kind that comes out when you've been holding your breath for a very long time and the air comes back. That's what I thought, Mara said quietly. She opened the fleet channel. All ships stand down from defensive posture, resume operations. Let's not waste any more time. Then she closed her eyes for exactly 4 seconds. Let her heart rate come down to something reasonable. Opened them again. Brennan, what's the status on the remaining 6 ships? 4 are in active recovery, ma'am. 2 are still awaiting assessment. Let's go assess them. The story of the formation bluff traveled fast. By the next day, every crew on every recovered ship knew what had happened. Knew that 8 vessels, half of them barely functional, 2 of them outright pretending, had stared down a raider group and made them flinch. The Kelvari told it to each other in a particular way. Not the way the human crew told it, which involved a lot of emphasis on the audacity of the move and some creative language about what the Vorath had or had not understood about what they were looking at. The Kelvari told it with a kind of quiet, examining quality, the way you tell a story you're still processing, the way you tell a story that changed something. Sub-Lieutenant Terran found Dario in the mess of the Relentless that evening. He was eating something. The notebook was on the table, open to a page covered in modifications to the counter-frequency method that incorporated suggestions from her engineering team. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Sure." He moved a stack of manuals so she could sit. "When the Admiral said we would not run, she knew we might lose." "Yeah." "And she chose to stay anyway. We had people on those ships that couldn't move fast enough to run. We had people in the middle of repairs. If we ran, we were deciding that those people weren't worth the risk of staying. She decided they were." Terran sat with that. In the Kelvari military, a commander in an unfavorable tactical position is expected to preserve fighting capacity for future engagements. A full retreat would have been within protocol. Dario thought about this. We do things like that sometimes, retreat, when the math says to, but I think there's also a math that includes what it means if people know you'll leave them, what it does to the people who are left, what it does to you. He picked up his coffee. Admiral Voss has a reputation. People follow her because she has that reputation. If she'd run today, the math changes, not just for this mission, for everything after. Terran was quiet for a moment. So she was also thinking about future missions. She was thinking about all of it at once. Dario shrugged. "I'm an engineer. I can barely think about the next hour, but she thinks like that." Terran looked at the notebook on the table, then at him. "Can I make a copy of this?" He pushed it toward her. "You can have the whole thing. I know what's in it." She picked it up with the careful hands of someone holding something of value. "We are not what we expected," she said. He looked at her. "What did you expect?" A pause, honest and a little uncomfortable. Aggressive, territorial, technically capable but difficult to work with. Her middle eye tracked to the viewport, where the debris field was still lit in the amber of their running lights. "Every report we have on humanity says you are a species that does not cooperate well." "We cooperate fine," Dario said. "We just cooperate on our own terms, which sometimes looks like not cooperating from the outside." He drank his coffee. "We're also very loud about it, which I think scares people." Terran considered this. "You are very loud." "We really are." Outside, the work was already resuming. Patel's team was on the Kelvari Sunreach. 2 of her junior engineers had apparently developed a modified hull sealing technique in the last 48 hours that was 20 minutes faster than standard procedure, and that they were applying with the territorial pride of people who had invented something. The Sunreach's Kelvari engineers were watching them, asking questions, taking notes. Someone laughed. The sound carried through the corridor. Mara was in her office, writing names. There would be more before the end, there were always more. But there would also be ships, and people who had lived because the people around them refused to walk away. That was the math she believed in. The work would finish, then they would bring the fleet home. And what the council would see arriving, battered, patched, limping but moving, carrying more lives than anyone had expected, was going to require some explaining. She was looking forward to doing the explaining. On day 19, they brought the fleet home. Not all of it. 3 ships were too far gone, stripped to the hull by Vorath weapons that left nothing worth working with, and Mara had marked them, documented them, and moved on, because that was all you could do, and she had made her peace with it before the mission was over. You didn't get everything. You got what you could reach. What she could reach was 9 ships. 9 out of the original 12 survivors. 9 out of a fleet that the Kelvari's own engineers had assessed as largely unrecoverable. 9 ships that were, variously, at 60%, 70%, and in 3 cases very nearly full operational capacity, depending on how you counted the things that Patel and Dario and the growing team of joint human Kelvari engineers had improvised into them over 19 days. The repairs were not all standard. Some of them were, frankly, creative. The Kelvari Silver Path was now running a hybrid power routing system that used 2 human-source components in a configuration that technically didn't exist in any manual anywhere. It worked. Dario had tested it, explained the underlying physics to 3 increasingly fascinated Kelvari engineers, and they had confirmed that it worked, and then stood around it for another hour arguing amongst themselves about why it worked in a way that seemed scientifically productive. The Kelvari Golden Name had an entirely new secondary hull section. Not Kelvari hull plating, they'd run out. Human-sourced plating from the Cape Horn's reserve stores, cut and fitted by Patel's team, and then bonded with a Kelvari adhesive compound that was technically designed for smaller applications but had handled the load anyway. The patch was visually distinctive. It was also structurally sound. Mara had looked at it once and thought that it looked like something alive, a scar, not a wound. Evidence that the ship had fought and survived and been put back together by the best available hands. She had decided she liked it. The council was waiting for them at the Concord Transit Hub. Not just Ambassador Quell. 12 council representatives from 8 member species, which Brennan quietly informed her was an unprecedented gathering for what was technically a salvage return. The docking bay had been cleared of all non-essential traffic. There were formal banners, a Kelvari ceremonial escort in full dress, which meant, Varys had explained, very dark colors and very precise posture, because the Kelvari did ceremony the way they did everything else, with committed seriousness. Mara stood in the shuttle bay of the Relentless with her team behind her, and looked at the docking display showing the formation of recovered ships moving into position around the hub, and thought about a lot of things, in no particular order. She thought about the Dawn's crew, 48 people who had not expected rescue and had gotten it anyway. She thought about the 2 people in the medical bay who had not made it, whose names were in her log. She thought about Dario sitting on the floor of the engineering core when the core came online, looking surprised that it had worked. She thought about 4 Vorath raiders turning away from 8 ships that were mostly pretending. Then the docking collar locked, and Lieutenant Brennan opened the door and she walked out first, because that was the job. Ambassador Quell met her at the end of the docking corridor. He was tall, even for a Talari, and he had the careful, measured quality of a diplomat who had spent a very long time learning to control his expressions. Right now, some of that control was having a hard time. He looked at the recovered ships on the display behind her. He counted. She watched him count. 9, he said. 9, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, our estimate when we requested your assistance was that 3 ships might be recoverable, 4 if circumstances were favorable. I know. You recovered 9. We tried for 12. 3 were beyond what we could do. She met his eyes, Talari eyes, large and amber, and currently doing something she didn't have enough cultural context to fully read, but that she suspected was not disappointment, I'm sorry for the 3 we couldn't bring back." He shook his head. Something in the gesture was very quiet. "Admiral Voss, we gave you a fleet of the dead and you gave us back." He stopped, recalibrated. "You gave us back 9 ships and over 400 surviving crew members. We expected perhaps 60 survivors in total." 412, her log said. She had checked this morning. 412 names. "Your engineers," she said. "They adapted faster than I expected. Sub-Lieutenant Taryn's team in particular. Their modifications to the counter-frequency method were genuinely innovative. This was their operation too." Quell looked at something past her shoulder. She turned. Taryn was standing with Dario and 3 other Kelvari engineers, all of them talking with the focused intensity of people mid-conversation about something they found important. Taryn had the notebook, Dario's notebook, dog-eared and full of cross-species engineering notes, open in her hands, and she was pointing at something. Dario was nodding vigorously. "There has been," Quell said, "discussion in the Council about humanity for a long time, since your species first made contact. Discussion about how to categorize you, how to assess your risk profile, how to understand what you are." "And what's the current conclusion?" Quell's expression did something careful. "There isn't one. That is, I think, the point. Every report that comes in from any contact with your species contradicts some previous report. You are described as aggressive and then cooperative, territorial and then generous, reckless and then methodical." He paused. "One report from approximately 30 years ago described humanity as the species most likely to either save or destroy the galaxy, depending on the day." Mara almost smiled. "That sounds about right." "I begin to understand it better now," he said. "You do not fit the models because the models assume a species behaves consistently. You behave adaptively." "We behave like ourselves," she said. "It's just that ourselves is a pretty wide range." Quell was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that was, she suspected, not easy for a diplomat to say. "I should tell you that there were members of the Council who opposed requesting your assistance, who believed that inviting humanity into a military recovery situation in a sensitive region of space was an acceptable risk at best, that your presence would complicate the political landscape." She kept her voice even. "I appreciate you telling me that." "They were wrong," he said simply. "I want that to be stated directly, not as a political position, as a fact. They were wrong." She nodded. "Let that sit for a moment. What happens now?" "Now the Council will receive the recovered fleet and its crew. There will be ceremonies. There will be considerable documentation." He looked at her carefully. "And there will be conversations about the Vorath, about what the Conquered does when the 3rd wave arrives." He paused. "About what kind of assistance might be mutually beneficial." "Mutually beneficial," she said. "Yes, that word is deliberate." She had expected this, in the way you expected something you've been watching build from a distance. The request for salvage had not been only a request for salvage. She'd understood that from the beginning. If the Conquered was going to ask humanity for help, really ask, they needed to know first if it was worth asking, if humans delivered. The 9 ships behind her were the answer to that question. "Tell the Council I'm available whenever they want to talk," she said. The ceremony was formal and long, in the Kelvari tradition, and Mara stood at attention through it with the practiced patience of a career military officer, and only checked the time twice. Afterward, there was something more informal. Kelvari description was a gathering of intent, which the translator helpfully explained meant a setting where formal hierarchy was loosened and direct conversation was encouraged. Mara sat at a table that included Varys, Quell, 2 other council representatives, Patel, Dario, and Sub-Lieutenant Taryn. There was food, some of which was for humans and some of which was not, and everyone navigated this with the reasonable grace of people who had spent 3 weeks figuring out how to work together in a debris field. Taryn passed the notebook across the table to Dario. He looked at it. I said you could keep it. I made copies, she said, of the relevant sections. The rest are your observations. You should have them. He took it back slowly, looked at it for a moment. You copied the right sections. I also added annotations. She was very precise. My engineering team's annotations are in the gray ink. Mine are in the blue. We thought you should have a complete record. He opened the notebook, flipped to a page in the middle, sat there reading the annotations. Something went quiet in his face that had been running fast for 19 days. Patel, who was sitting next to Mara, leaned over and said very quietly, "He's going to need a minute." "He's earned one," Mara said just as quietly. Quell watched this and then asked Mara with genuine curiosity, "He is your engineer?" "One of the best I've worked with." "He does not behave as I expected an engineer to behave." "How did you expect him to behave?" Quell thought carefully. In the Concord, engineering is considered a discipline of precision. Its practitioners are valued for their exactness, for knowing the correct answer. A pause. He does not appear to prioritize knowing the correct answer. He prioritizes getting the right outcome, Mara said. There's a difference. Sometimes you can get to the right outcome without knowing exactly how you got there, and that's fine as long as you got there. Quell sat with this. The council has engineering councils, committees that approve methodologies. There are forms. We have those too, Mara said. Dario has been known to submit the forms after the work is done. And this is accepted. It's accepted when the work is correct. She picked up her drink. We're very results-oriented. Varys, who had been listening, said, I have been in many council debriefings. I have heard many mission reports. I have never heard a commander apologize for ships that could not be recovered. Usually the losses are documented and filed. I told Quell I was sorry for the 3 ships. I noticed. They mattered. She kept her voice flat. The people on them mattered. Apologizing doesn't fix it, but not apologizing would have been, she considered, wrong, the wrong way to carry it. Varys was quiet for a moment. His middle eye was very steady. You carry your losses, he said. Yes. Not just as data, you carry them. She nodded. He looked at the table. The Kelvari military also does this, but we do not, he paused, found the word. We do not show it. It is considered the weight of command, a private burden. It is a private burden, Mara said, but it's also a public acknowledgement that those names mattered, that someone sees them. She looked at him. When I apologized to Quell, I was making a record that the 3 ships mattered to me, that I didn't walk away clean. Varys was quiet for a long moment. The council, he said finally, will want to talk about the Vorith, about the 3rd wave. I know. They will want human help. I know that too. Will you come? She looked out the viewport. The 9 recovered ships were in their docking positions now, running lights on, systems operational. Patchwork and repaired, with human hull plates and alien power cores, and a combined manual's worth of improvised solutions holding them together. They looked like survivors. Yeah, she said, we'll come. She set down her drink and looked at the people around the table, Human and Kelvari and Talari, eating food not designed for all of them, sitting in a space that had been formal 2 hours ago and was now just people after a long job. The galaxy was about to meet humanity in a different context than salvage. She was already thinking about what to bring. The Vorith 3rd wave arrived 2 weeks later. The council had used those 2 weeks. Whatever bureaucratic hesitation had existed before the salvage mission came back, the slow-moving machinery of 11 species trying to agree on anything at the same time, had been replaced by something faster and less comfortable. Purpose, maybe, or fear. Fear is a reliable lubricant. Mara had been in 3 council sessions in those 2 weeks, more meetings than she had attended in the previous year combined, and she had sat at tables surrounded by beings who were very carefully trying not to ask her directly what humanity was going to commit to, and she had very carefully not offered it until they asked, because the politics of it mattered, because being invited was different from showing up uninvited, and because the conquered needed to decide for itself what kind of relationship it wanted. They decided. Ambassador Quell came to her office on the Relentless on a Tuesday, again Tuesday. She was starting to have opinions about Tuesdays, and he sat down across from her and he said, "The Council would like to formally request a mutual defense partnership with humanity, full Conquered membership, with all corresponding rights and obligations." She put her coffee down. Full membership. Full membership. She had expected to be asked. She had not expected full membership. That was the next 10 steps, not the next step. Full membership was not what you offered a species you'd been diplomatically avoiding for 40 years out of a complicated mixture of caution and cultural uncertainty. Full membership was a statement. "You've moved fast," she said. "We have moved slow for 40 years," he said. "We chose caution and distance, and in the end the Vorath came anyway, and when they came, we discovered that the species we had been cautiously avoiding was the only one who could give us our fleet back." He was careful, deliberate. "The Council has concluded that caution was not the wisdom we believed it to be." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll need to take this to the United Earth Council." "Of course. It'll take time. There are political realities on our end, too." "Of course, but Admiral," he paused, "regardless of the outcome of those conversations, regardless of the formal outcome, what I want you to know is that the Council's position is no longer one of careful neutrality. Whatever happens, we do not consider humanity a managed uncertainty anymore." "What do we consider humanity?" She couldn't quite stop the slight edge of irony in the question. Quell's expression did something she hadn't seen from him before, something that was, if she was reading it correctly, as close to warm as Talari diplomatic training permitted. Something we should have asked to know sooner. She picked her coffee back up. Well, better late than never. The battle against the Vorath Third Wave was not one battle. It was 9 days of engagement across 4 star systems, hitting the Vorath at approach points, at resupply corridors, at jump-exit positions the Council's intelligence had flagged, and that Mara's tactical team had cross-referenced against every Vorath action pattern in the database. The Relentless and the Cape Horn fought alongside the Kelvari Armada. The 9 recovered ships, plus reinforcements from the Kelvari home fleet, plus vessels from 4 other conquered species who had activated their mutual defense obligations. This was not a standard fleet structure. Standard fleet structures were built on shared doctrine, shared communications protocols, shared training. What they had was a patchwork, a conquered fleet that had never operated together, coordinating in real time across 11 different tactical traditions. It should have been a disaster. Mara had thought hard about this problem in the 2 weeks before the Vorath arrived. She had talked to her tactical officers, to Varys, to the Kelvari Armada's new fleet commander, a quiet, methodical woman named Admiral Sorn, who had survived the initial attack by being on the wrong ship for the wrong reasons, and had spent 9 days in a debris field before rescue. The conclusion they came to was simple: don't force a unified doctrine. Let each species do what it did best. Build coordination around that, not on top of it. Kelvari ships were built for endurance and sustained fire. They held lines. They anchored positions. Talari vessels were fast and maneuverable. They worked the flanks, forcing the Vorath to spread their attention. The human destroyers did something none of the other species did instinctively, which was to go places the tactical analysis said were dangerous, and find out that the tactical analysis was sometimes wrong. Brennan, trying to document this for the official report during a lull in the second day of fighting, had asked Mara how to categorize it. "Calculated risk," she said. The calculation is. We calculate that there's a chance we're wrong and we go anyway. She watched the tactical display. Write it down as aggressive forward reconnaissance. It sounds better. The Vorath third wave was not the force they had expected. It was larger than projected. The initial wave had apparently reported back something about the Conquered's defensive weakness that had caused the Vorath command structure to reinforce significantly. On day 3 of the engagement, the numbers looked bad. Mara stood on the bridge of the Relentless and looked at the numbers and felt the quiet that comes from knowing you're in a situation where being right is not enough and being brave is not enough, and you have to be something specific that you can't quite name until after it's over. She opened the fleet channel. All Conquered vessels, this is Admiral Voss. I see the same numbers you're looking at. I want to say something about them. The Vorath have more ships than we expected. They know it. They're counting on that knowledge doing some work for them, on it making us hesitate or pull back or reconsider. I want to make it clear that we are not doing any of those things. She paused. Here's what I know. The Kelvari held their lines for 9 days in a debris field on emergency power. The Talari have been fighting this enemy since the first wave and they're still fighting. And every crew in this fleet volunteered to be here knowing what the odds were. Another pause. The Vorath have more ships. We have better reasons. Let's go remind them what that means. She closed the channel. Brennan was looking at her with an expression she recognized as the one he made when she said something he was going to have to write down later. Don't, she said. I'm just nodding. I know what you're nodding. Focus on the battle. The turning point came on day 6. It came from Dario, which, in retrospect, made sense. He was not a combat officer. He was a salvage engineer who happened to be aboard the Relentless because he had been on the salvage mission, and then the situation had changed around him and here he was. He was not in a combat role. He was in the engineering bay, which was where he had been since the engagement started, keeping the ship running. On day 6, he came to the bridge. He had his notebook. He had the look on his face that Mara had learned to recognize over 19 days in the debris field, the look that meant he had been working on something in the background while everyone was watching something else, and the something had resolved into a shape he thought was usable. The Vorath use a formation called a Corisette, he said. It's in the tactical database. 3 ships, the center one acting as a coordination hub for the other 2. It's effective because the hub ship is in the safest position. The 2 flankers take all the fire. We know about the Corisette, the tactical officer said. Do you know that their hub ship uses a broadcast frequency to maintain real-time formation coordination with the flankers? And that broadcast frequency it's almost identical to the Kelvari triaxial core resonance frequency. He opened his notebook. It's not exact, but it's close enough that I think we can introduce a countersignal. Silence on the bridge. You want to broadcast a countersignal into the Vorath formation coordination system, Mara said. I want to make the hub ship think it's receiving a shutdown command. If I can do that, the flankers lose coordination. They don't know what the hub ship is doing. The formation breaks. A shutdown command, she said, like you did with the Kelvari cores. He clicked his pen. Same principle, different application. I'm about 79% on this one. That's worse than before, Brennan said. The application is less controlled, Dario agreed, but the underlying principle is sound. Mara looked at the tactical display. At the Vorath formation geometry, the neat Corisette structures that had been holding their flanks organized and efficient for 6 days. Do it, she said. He did it. The countersignal went out on day 6, hour 14. It took 6 attempts to find the right frequency. The Vorath hub ship's broadcast wasn't in any database, so Dario was scanning and adjusting in real time, talking to himself in a low, steady voice that the bridge crew pretended not to hear. On the 7th attempt, 3 Vorath Corsets broke formation simultaneously. The flanker ships didn't know what was happening. The hub ships were running restart cycles. For 47 seconds, 3 of the most effective Vorath tactical formations in the engagement were operating without coordination. The Talari flankers hit them in those 47 seconds. The Kelvari line ships hit them in those 47 seconds. The Relentless and Cape Horn hit them in those 47 seconds. When the hub ships came back online, the flankers had already broken, pulling away from a coordinated assault they didn't understand, and the shape of the battle had changed. It did not change all at once. It changed the way battles sometimes change, gradually, then faster, then suddenly it was clear. And the Vorath knew it was clear, and on day 9 they reversed course. They left. Not a final victory. The Vorath were not defeated, only stopped. Mara was careful about this in every conversation after stopped, not defeated. The distinction mattered, both strategically and for the morale of species that needed to stay ready. But they were stopped, and the Concord's joint fleet, messy, multi-species, operating on borrowed doctrine and improvised solutions, had stopped them. The Council held a formal session the week after. Mara attended, with Varys and Sub-Lieutenant Taryn and Dario, who wore his best jacket and had still somehow managed to bring the notebook. The session was long. There were speeches. There was ceremony. There was the formal establishment of the Mutual Defense Framework, recorded in Concord archives, witnessed by all 12 Council representatives. And then there was the moment where Ambassador Quell, on behalf of the Council, looked at the human delegation and said something that would be quoted in every record of that day for a long time afterward. "When we gave you our broken fleet," he said, "we were asking a question. We were asking what kind of species you were, what you would do with something that the rest of us had given up on." He paused. "You gave us back 9 ships. You gave us back our people. And then when the enemy came, you found a way to fight them with the same tools you used to put our ships back together. Not because you were asked, because it was there to be done and you could see how to do it." Another pause. The galaxy trusted Earth with a wrecked fleet. What returned changed everything. That is the record we are entering today. Mara sat with that. The formal language would go into archives. The numbers would go into reports. The strategic analysis would be written by people whose job was strategic analysis, and it would be thorough and accurate and probably use the phrase unprecedented interspecies cooperation at least a dozen times. None of it would quite capture the part that mattered to her. It wouldn't capture Dario on the floor of the Dawn's engineering core. It wouldn't capture Patel bargaining 4 hours down to 5 hours 40 in the dark. It wouldn't capture 48 people in a ship that should have killed them, surviving because they wouldn't stop working. It wouldn't capture 4 Vorath raiders looking at a fleet of mostly pretending ships and deciding to leave. It wouldn't capture Sub-Lieutenant Taryn's annotations in gray ink in someone else's notebook. It wouldn't capture 412 names. After the formal session, Mara stood outside the council chambers in a corridor that looked out over the docking hub where the 9 recovered ships were berthed. They were being resupplied and maintained now. They looked not new. They would never look new again, but they looked used, purposefully used, the way a thing looks when it has been through something and is still here. Vera stood beside her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it. "Tired. And I don't know. There's a thing that happens after a hard job where you've been going so hard for so long that when it stops you don't quite know what to do with your body. The Kelvari have a word for this." "What is it?" He said it. It was 3 syllables, soft consonants. It translates approximately as, the rest that the body takes before the mind realizes the danger is gone. She repeated it back, not perfectly. He corrected her gently. She tried again. "Better," he said. She looked at the ships. "We're going to have to build something between our species, something more permanent than a crisis arrangement." "Yes. It'll be complicated. There'll be disagreements, Political ones, cultural ones. There'll be days when the council thinks we're too chaotic and we think the council is too slow. Yes. But we're here, she said. That's different from where we were 40 years ago. Very different, he said. She straightened up, rolled her shoulders, felt the tired in them and acknowledged it and moved on because that was the habit of a long career. Acknowledge the cost, keep moving. I have to write a report, she said. The United Earth Council is going to want a thorough account. Of course. And then I have to eat something. Brennan has been leaving sandwiches on my desk and I keep not eating them. That seems like a problem to correct. It does. She turned from the viewport, took one last look at the 9 ships. Come find me when you're hungry. I'll introduce you to the concept of the turkey sandwich and you can tell me what the Kelvari equivalent is. Varys's middle eye did the thing she had learned to read as something close to a smile. We have something called prepared comfort food. It is not elegant, but it is very good. Perfect, she said. She walked back into the corridor, toward her office, toward the report, toward the work that was already beginning again. The crisis had passed. The next thing was starting. There was a mutual defense framework to build, a relationship between humanity and the conquered to develop from first steps into something that might last, a political landscape that was going to require careful navigation and probably several arguments. And there was a wrecked fleet that wasn't wrecked anymore. 9 ships, 412 names. Everything else would build from that. She had a report to write. She had a sandwich to eat. She had a lot of work to do. She was already looking forward to it.